At the center of everything, there is a lamb, slaughtered but living, with scars that endure, swallowed by death, but defiantly risen. In spite of our misguided wishing for lions, and over against all imperial decrees, rise the songs of resistance, the anthems of praise, to the Lamb who is love at the center of everything. Around him are gathered innumerable faces of each color and gender and nation and tongue, and to him pledge allegiance, in him shape their lives, for they trust in God's reign as old systems give way. At the center of everything, here stands the Lamb, and at the end of everything, there comes a new beginning. Welcome to the fifth part in our ongoing series, Lamb Power, taking a look at the book of Revelation and looking to find the thread of good news in what is sometimes a very daunting and difficult, sometimes pretty scary book of the Bible. I hope if you've been with us in previous sessions, whether in person in our live Bible study series on Tuesday nights or just been watching by video, I hope you've seen that there is this really beautiful, powerful thread of good news that I think makes sense of all the confusing and disparate imagery throughout the book of Revelation. It has everything to do with God's victory over all the powers of evil, not by playing by evil's rules or accepting evil's terms, but victory that comes through the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's good news. And that God's victory through suffering love, God's victory through love that looks like a slain but living lamb, not Caesar's decrees or powerful armies, that good news casts the whole rest of the book in a new light. However, when we get to the chapters we're looking at in this fifth session, chapters basically 17 through 20, it seems especially challenging to figure out what's going on. Should I be happy or sad or angry or both or what? And where is there good news in scenes of destruction and violence and utter horror and chaos? So no song to kick off this video companion. I know for a number of our other video sessions we've borrowed pop culture songs or used even songs of faith in the church to help be an entry point for us. No songs today, but a speech maybe, and maybe a bit of historical setting. Before we jump back to the first century and John writing in exile on Patmos, let's start with the 1960s. In fact, let's start with September 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, when several members of the local Ku Klux Klan detonated a bomb in the 16th Street Baptist Church there in Birmingham, which killed 4 little girls going to Sunday school that morning. Others were injured, of course, in the blast, and the church itself didn't reopen for worship for the better part of a year, not until the following summer. But 4 little girls lost their lives because of the hatred and white supremacy of several conspirators, at least one who was convicted and several others later on, decades later, who were convicted for being involved in the plot. At the funeral of those little girls there in Birmingham, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was asked to give a eulogy. And in one of the opening paragraphs of that eulogy, he makes a really, really powerful point. He's speaking about how do you find meaning or how do you address the horror of what's happened to these little girls, and how do we talk about who's responsible? I mean, this is just, days, weeks after these girls had been murdered. The trial wouldn't happen for another 14 years. No trial happened until the 1970s, the late 1970s, for a bombing that happened in 1963. And Dr. King says this: as he considers what the deaths of these 4 little girls mean. He says, "They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, and the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their death says to us we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. So they did not die in vain." God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. What I want to spend a moment thinking about there is, if you're going to ask who is the villain, who are you supposed to be upset at, who do we need to stop in a horrible act like the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963. There were offenders, there were perpetrators who physically planted the bombs, who intended to kill people and ended up killing 4 little girls. But King points out that the identity of the actual murders is one piece of it. But if all you do is put that person in jail or punish that person, but you leave the wider system alone, it's going to do that again, and other people will be led to do more acts of violence against somebody else's little girl or little boy. Others would die because of the system that produces that kind of hatred that works its way into all the nooks and crannies of human life. That was part of the reality of living in Birmingham in the 1960s. And because King understood that hatred, that racism wasn't just in the hearts of one bomber or his accomplices, but in a whole way of life, a whole system that had control there, you have to deal with the whole system. And when someone is caught and tried, you want to be able to find peace in knowing, okay, they can't do that again. They can't harm somebody else. And also it points toward the hope that maybe the whole system could be pulled down, that maybe all of that racial hatred could finally at some point be destroyed, be undone, so that nobody would have to worry about their little kids going to Sunday school and being blown up because a KKK member was driven to that kind of violence. One of the things I find so helpful, even if it's difficult, about the book of Revelation is it seems to be one of those books that clearly understands that evil has a way of not just showing up in individual bad actions or people we want to see as villainous, but in whole systems that infect and affect all the people who live within them. Right? Like King says, it's not just about who the murderers were of the 16th Street bombing, but about the whole system of thinking, the hatred that poisoned minds so that somebody thought it was a good idea to blow up a church in the name of white supremacy. In a similar way, the book of Revelation seems to understand the empire of the day that John of Patmos was living in, Rome, was the current sort of face of villainy, and certainly Rome and Caesar and his armies had done plenty of terrible, rotten things. But in a sense, the system that Rome was the figurehead for goes a long, long way back to a long line of equally rotten empires, and also can stretch further out into the future. Even one day when Rome as an empire is gone, other empires can come and do the same terrible, rotten things with a new letterhead or a new name or a new logo. The problem is that whole domination system needs to be dealt with and undone. And when finally Rome, the empire of the day, is thwarted, there can be relief. Okay, at least these people, at least this empire can't hurt people anymore. But it also points toward a deeper need to finally deal with the systemic evil, the powerful, bigger than any one of us evil that is operative throughout time and in culture after culture, empire after empire. In other words, John isn't just looking to get rid of Rome and say, well, the Romans are the problem, let's just have a different empire, but to undo the whole system that sets itself up as a counterfeit to God's good and gracious reign of justice and mercy. So in chapter 17 of the book of Revelation, we get this sort of final caricature, personification of the powers of the day in John's day. John, of course, lives during the height of the Roman Empire. It has fully become an empire, not just a republic that conquers its neighbors, but since Julius Caesar and then Augustus Caesar, they have a tyrant, a despot who reigns at the top of the pyramid and then who sends armies out to conquer all the known world. But John knows to write in coded language, so he doesn't talk about Rome as our enemy, at least not directly. He refers to Babylon as the enemy. And Babylon is personified as this woman who rides on this terrible, horrific beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And in addition to being pretty grotesque, this figure, this woman who is dressed luxuriously and who sort of has dalliances with all the powerful of all the earth and is drunk, but drunk on the blood of those she's killed. She's the symbol of like all of the wealth and power and glamour and glory of the worldly powers, but also of the sheer gory, disgusting, grotesque violence as well. And then John just sort of tips his hand and goes, okay, let me tell you who I'm really talking about. I'm calling her Babylon, but that's a way of talking about Rome. He goes on to say the 7 heads of the beast that she rides on are the 7 hills on which her city is built. It represents the city that rules all the nations of the world. That's a way of talking about Rome in John's day. And what John is envisioning is that Rome that announces to the world it will last forever, and its reign and its peace will bring security and law and order to all places, that won't last. In fact, it will crumble under its own weight. That's the thing about the powers of evil. Unlike God's power that sort of is constantly self-giving and flowing out from God, the source, to bring life everywhere, evil is always a counterfeit. It has to eat something else, has to consume, has to conquer and take and eat, and eventually it just gets so big and lethargic it collapses under its own weight and starts to eat itself. John sees the powers of empire collapsing, and that at some point the powerful kings that ally themselves with Rome and with the empire will turn on it and it will crumble. Now, that begins this pretty dark chapter. Chapter 18 has this sort of long, lamenting kind of a passage about the fall of Babylon. Again, that's talking about Rome. And that's scary, right? That's like saying the superpower of the day, looking forward to that superpower collapsing. If you're invested in the order of the day, if you're invested in life as you've always known it and Rome being in charge, that's scary, right? To almost anybody else in John's world, if you stop somebody on the street and said, how would you feel if the Roman Empire collapsed? They'd be scared. It's all they know, right? People have a way of wanting the devil they know instead of the devil they don't know. People would be scared if the way you lived your life and understood the economy and understood political balances and things. If all that came crashing down, it would be scary. And yet John sees this as finally at last, the empire that has done so much terrible, rotten stuff won't get to do that forever. And it points to a deeper need that the whole system that we human beings keep creating and participating in, this domination system, that needs to be dealt with too. So in chapter 18, we get this lament of all the people who had a stake in the empire. They're sad, right? They're sad because their source of income has gone away. The powerful people who had aligned themselves with Rome, with Babylon, that they're sad when it all collapses. But then in chapter 19, we get this sort of parallel view from God's vantage point, from the heavenly throne room. They can't hurt anybody anymore. Rome has blood on its hands. The empire has blood on its hands. In fact, at the end of chapter 18, there's this angelic voice that says, not only does Babylon, Rome, have the blood of the saints and prophets and apostles on its hands, it also has the blood of all those slaughtered in all the earth. The way of empire is just this unending violence where people can be killed in the name of, we need to expand our grasp, we need to expand our empire. Empires keep doing this, whether it was Pharaoh's Egypt or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greeks or Rome or all of history's empires since. When you're a part of the empire, that sounds like a pretty good deal for you. It sounds like, yeah, as long as other people are the ones who suffer, that doesn't bother me, as long as I can have a nice, comfortable way of life. And John says that's not okay. From God's vantage point, God doesn't want human beings to live in that way. That's a counterfeit to God's good reign. And God's intention, God's way, is for all those powers of empire to be unmasked and finally broken so they can't hurt anyone anymore. Like King says in his eulogy for the girls in the 16th Street Church bombing, it's not just about identifying the perpetrators of the crime, but the system that creates that. That needs to go as well. That's not okay either. And for John, that means it's not just we need to get rid of Caesar or we need to get rid of the Roman Empire, but we need the forces that are at work underneath that keep raising their head, that keep surfacing and doing this all over again, that we then willingly participate in. That has to be dealt with. Which leads us then in chapter 19 toward the announcement. We're finally getting there. Finally, God is at last about to deal with the powers underneath all along, right? God's finally going to deal with the root cause. So Babylon, Rome, will come to an end, but the powers underneath will be dealt with as well too. And so there's this turn. Lament from the powerful people and the people who make their living off the empire. They're all weeping through chapter 18. Oh, it's so sad, Babylon has fallen. And the heavenly perspective, Babylon has fallen, yay! This is like if you watch Star Wars and you go, yay, the Death Star is blown up, right? That's a big explosion, but oh, good. The empire can't hurt anybody anymore. Good, finally, good triumphs. We've been waiting for so long. The book of Revelation then it drops the hint of a coming idea that there will be a marriage feast for the Lamb. A lamb image that we've come through over and over and over again, this figure for Christ, right? That there's Jesus, the Lamb who is slain, who is alive. Again, that there's a marriage celebration coming. And then there's this interesting turn. A new figure appears that clearly is meant to be a symbol for Jesus, a rider whose name is faithful and true and the Word of God, who has one weapon, a sword that comes from his mouth, which is John's rather visual way of saying the only weapon, the only power or authority this rider on a white horse needs is the power of his word, right? Just like at creation, right? When God creates the universe, taming the chaos and destroying all the darkness and instead bringing life and beauty and order, God speaks the universe into existence, and there it is, right? So here again, Jesus now speaks. All he needs is the power of his word. He's draped in a robe that's dipped in blood. And this is a detail I think we need to spend a moment on. It might be tempting if we knew nothing of who Jesus was to go, oh, this is the blood of his enemies. I don't think so. I think everything we've seen about the nature of Jesus in the book of Revelation, much less than the entire New Testament, is to say the way Jesus conquers is through his own death and resurrection. It's Jesus' blood. Right? We saw earlier that this image of the white-robed martyrs from every nation, tribe, and tongue who have their robes that are made white in the blood of the Lamb. So here, of course, Jesus himself, his robe has been dipped in his own blood. That Jesus' way of winning God's victory is through his own self-giving love. It's the cross and resurrection that's God's victory, not some need to smash armies into dust with God's kind of violence. No, God doesn't need to do that. God's victory is accomplished through Jesus' death and resurrection. And so then, the rider appears on the scene, and all the armies of the beast now are allied against him. Even though we saw Babylon, the woman who's riding on this beast, has been defeated and destroyed. But now it's like the powers underneath that are finally coming for this final confrontation, right? We were built up toward it last time. We looked at, there's this announcement of all the armies gathering at the place called Armageddon, the hill of Megiddo, the valley of Megiddo, right? And it seems like, okay, we're primed for a battle to happen, and almost anticlimactically, the battle's over before it's even begun. We don't even get an active verb. It's the beast was captured. Who did the capturing? How did it happen? How long did it take? We get none of that. In other words, we're sort of primed. Okay, now we're going to have the big action sequence. There's going to be the big final showdown, a fight between God and evil, or Jesus and the devil, or something like that. And instead, Jesus shows up on the scene, and at the word, they're disarmed. They're destroyed. The powers that underlie even the Roman Empire or the Babylonians or the Egyptians before them, the powers are broken once and for all. And as scary as that can be, if you're invested in empire, that's good news if you really want human beings to be free from oppression and free from the fear of violence that empire keeps doing over and over and over and over again. I want to suggest that's really what's going on in these chapters. In chapters 17 through 20, I don't think we're meant to construct some sort of timeline to figure out what empire will be on the scene and what will be the battle that brings it all to an end, and then how do we calculate when Jesus comes back after that. It's tempting to want to play that game, but I think it completely misreads what John's trying to do in this book. He's not been trying to give us a chronology. Here's how you can predict when Jesus will come, but more to say, the real enemy we have to deal with isn't just the empire of the day. They're the latest face of it. And yeah, eventually that will crumble too, because empires eventually collapse in on themselves and get eaten by their own, which happened to Rome in due time too. But that underneath it, the other forces that are at work that are always aligning themselves against God's good reign of justice and mercy, those things will be dealt with in the end as well. And God's way of doing it isn't that we need to round up all the Christians to fight them. Jesus disarms them and brings them to nothing with just a word. The only weapon he needs, the sword that is his mouth, the word that he speaks, silences and stops all those who would harm us. And if you've been living under the fear of an empire, if you've been living in fear that they could come get you in the night, if you've been living in fear that somebody could come and harm you or somebody you love, if you finally hear they've been stopped, they can't do that, they can't hurt you anymore, that's good news. That brings peace. The point of these chapters in the book of Revelation is not for us to wallow or gloat when other people suffer. It's the relief of they can't hurt you anymore. If you've been a victim, if you've suffered at somebody else's hands, to hear that the perpetrator can't do that to you or to anybody else anymore, that's a source of peace. It's not about gloating or wanting to see other people suffer because they made you suffer. It's, they can't hurt anybody anymore. And that whole way of dominating and harming other people finally will be undone as well. That, I think, reframes all these chapters and helps to make sense of a really, really strange scene that comes in what we call chapter 20 of Revelation. We get this interesting message or image of a period of 1,000 years that the powers of good reign, and then somehow the powers of evil return again. And it can get really easy to get lost in the weeds about what's the meaning of these 1,000 years. There are some Christians who treat this as a literal period of 1,000 years, that Jesus will come before the 1,000 years, or after the 1,000 years, or first he'll come, then 1,000 years, then he'll come again. I want to suggest we're getting lost in the weeds if we try and make a chronology, when what this whole book has been trying to do is to say the powers of evil keep trying, they keep rearing their head over and over again and make systems that we all get drawn into, suckered into, and become complicit in. God's victory isn't just to replace one empire with a new empire, but eventually to get to the very, very root cause, so that even all the sources of evil finally can be dealt with, and finally there can be justice, there can be vindication. For people who had seen the bad guys get away with their schemes and their villainy over and over and over and over again, at some point you just ache and you want there to be justice done. You want to see, finally, can't the good guys finally win in the end? Can't innocent finally be protected instead of the guilty getting away with it because they've got all the power? And the hope that these chapters give us is that God won't settle for a reality where evil gets away again. But at the last, God's way of doing things is to ensure that evil's power is broken. Sometimes I think we forget why it's good to hope for justice, why it's good to hope that in the end, domination and violence and evil and corruption don't get the last word. And once all those sources of evil have been dealt with, and once all their power and bluster's finally been broken, now the stage is cleared for there to be new creation, maybe even for a wedding. That's where the book of Revelation ends. If all we had was God destroying things, or empire destroying itself, kind of, I'm not sure that would be much of an ending. But the book of Revelation doesn't stop with judgment. As much as we need justice, it doesn't just end with God smashes the guilty. There's now this promise of new creation. That's where we're headed next time. So I hope you'll join us next time for part 6 as we take a look at chapters 21 and 22 of Revelation. But I hope too, even these difficult chapters in 17 through 20, I hope you can hear in them something of the aching for things to be put right, the aching for justice that needs to be a part of our Christian faith. In something like what Dr. King talked about as he presided over the burial of those girls in Birmingham. That it's not just about apprehending the perpetrator of a crime, but the system underneath it needs to be dealt with and repaired as well. And God's hope isn't just to find one scapegoat and zap them, but to set everything right. Everything right. Even the places in me that have gone wrong too. God's hope is for nothing short of a whole renewed creation. Hold on to that thought as we gather next time here on Lamb Power.